So yeah, so thank you. So thanks for joining us on this second meeting. We'll just get the boring bits out of the way. We sent the minutes round for the last meeting. Anyone noticed any mistakes or anything with those? Assume not. Excellent. And are there any matters arising from those? Any follow-ups? Nope, good stuff. Just to fill you in or remind those who are new to the list that between last meeting and this meeting, we wrote to the PM to express our disappointment that his new approach to net zero was awful. That was sent around a bit as well. But we've not had a response. I don't know if we're necessarily expecting a response, but that's what that is. At the top of the meeting, I thought we'd do announcements here, being that this is supposed to be a network where we all kind of chip in and share what we're up to. So I think Catherine isn't here. She said she couldn't be here. Yeah. So she just reminded me that there's a Global Day of Action protest on the 9th of December for COP28. There's a planning session on this tomorrow, which Ellen, I think you're actually organising or involved in. I can send around the link, but I think maybe this has already been sent around. Do you want to talk briefly about that, Ellen? Or not?
Sorry,
you're eating, I think.
No, I just rushed in from the gardening session. So, but there isn't a huge amount else to say, really, apart from the fact that we've got 6 weeks, and it's going to be a very busy 6 weeks for everybody, all round. You know, the aim is to have mass mobilisations everywhere on the 9th of December. Obviously, it's a global thing. There will be mass mobilisations across the globe. There'll certainly be a big one in London, which I think London XR is taking a leading role in building. I know Lucinda's nodding away. They've got well underway in Sheffield and South Yorkshire already. But, you know, it's a bit frustrating because it's really something we should have been working on for months. And it takes, because what I think is the really, really important thing is the work we do between now and the 9th of December in actually building up, reaching out to different groups, different constituencies, spreading as much information as we can, because we're in a situation now where, you know, the entire population is being blatantly lied to by the government about, you know, for example, about all these false reasons that they're rolling out for having you know, new oil and gas exploration and stuff like that, for example, but also that, you know, both the major parties have hugely rolled back, you know, whatever feeble transition policies they had to start with. We're in absolute chaos, and so it's, you know, it's really urgent. We're going into an election year, so you know, it's important that people have the right information. So to me, that says it's the work we do between now and then, in actually, you know, getting leaflets out, doing stalls, maybe doing other events that bring people in from different parts of the community. So there is a national working group, COP26 Coalition. There's a national working group that anybody can join to work on messaging and get a leaflet together. Personally, I don't think that leaflet's going to be ready in time for us to do the work I've just been referring to. So I think we've got to kind of just crack on and do what, obviously taking notice of those conversations, because we want it to be as unified messaging as possible. But you know, I think we've got to crack on as well as taking part in that national thread of work. So the meeting tomorrow evening is for anybody in the Yorkshire and Humber region. You know, if people have already got their own thing that they're building for, then that's great. But at the minute, I think we're not completely certain whether we're going to have lots of disparate, you know, lots of, like one in York, one in Halifax, one in Huddersfield, whatever, or whether it's just we're going to go for, you know, really go for it in Leeds and try and pull everybody in, apart from South Yorkshire, obviously. So I did post the link to that meeting on, I think, the list that everybody here is on. I can put it again in the chat if that's, but I think
Yeah,
everyone.
maybe that. Yeah, I've got the link as well, so I can send it around afterwards. But I guess it's tomorrow, so yeah, maybe pop it in the chat now. That's great, thank you.
Can I just, I mean, what I would like to say is, sorry, I should have said this right at the start, but up to now, we've been very unsuccessful in getting a major trade union presence on these mobilisations. I mean, we always get some, we get, there's always a few of us from each of those towns that I've mentioned, but we're not getting mass presence of trade unions. And I know it's going to be tricky because some of our unions currently have official policies that are not entirely in line with what the global demands inevitably are going to be. But there's ways around it, and we need to be working on it. And some of the unions do have very progressive policies. So that's I think it's really a shame that we don't have a lot more visible trade unionism on these mobilisations.
Sure, yeah, no, of course, yeah, no, thanks for that. So yeah, it's tomorrow at 6 p.m. So you got the link.
7 p.m.
Oh, 7 p.m.
Oh, did I? No, I said 6, didn't I? Sorry, beg your pardon. It's 6.
Okay, yeah, no, I thought it did say 6.
Yes.
So yeah, if you want to join that, then that would be great. And whatever happens, that'll be the 9th of December is when we actually have to be out on the streets. Just to kind of go through the rest. So the sticking with COP28, the delegates, the trade union delegates, are still asking for feedback to take to COP28. So if anyone has any views, responsive perspectives to feedback into there, then just let us know. I guess we'll think about something from this, just what we've discussed already. But if anyone has any personal stuff, then they can let us know as well. Catherine also wanted me to raise that the next meeting of the West Yorkshire Eco Educators Group is on the 13th of November at 7 p.m. It's online. I'm sure she'll send around a link. So this is a group that is, I think it's for schools, right? Like teachers in schools and people in schools to.
Actually, it's for any teachers.
Okay, right. So broaden that. So actually, maybe Debbie, you've got your hand up anyway. So do you want to expand on that and say what you wanted to say? Do you want to expand on that? And you've got your hand up anyway. So
I've got my hand up to support Ellen, because it was lamentable what happened over the COP27 day of action in Yorkshire. And York sent a minibus that was half full or half empty. It was pathetic. The only people in Sheffield were, well, I mean, from outside Sheffield, were the sort of hardcore amongst us. And so I think if people can spread the word on your union, whatever way you share information, that it's happening. And I will argue strongly for a York presence. I've circulated it really widely, all the people I can think of in York who are connected, who will forward it on, because, it's something to keep in the building, as Ellen said, building for it is important and following it up is important. And it's no use crowing about how big York Environment Week was if we then sort of go back to our slumbers for another year. So I just to support, and I passed that on to this list, Ellen, this morning, as soon as I saw it for the Zoom tomorrow. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Debbie. That's great. Yeah, I mean, of course, yeah, more the merrier with these things. Just the rest of announcements. There was We Make Tomorrow. I've actually got the leaflet here, which is on the 25th of November in London. Ellen, I think you wanted to talk about this. Do you want to? Maybe that's enough. It's an important conference, and so if you do want to go along, then you'd be more than welcome, I'm sure.
Well, again, I'd like to say that so I'm involved in the programme organising for that. But we really we need everybody's help in with the outreach to know, to really get, and they, what the ambition is to get a spread of workers and trade unionists from a wide range of sectors, because we all know, like, it's dead easy to half of us, you know, the half of us will be from Unite Community. You know, there's that. Then you always get a lot of people from, you know, PCS administrators, NEU teachers, UCU teachers. You know, you get a lot of those people, and you know, that's fantastic. Nothing wrong with that at all. But it's we find it a lot harder to recruit people from, you know, energy, construction, technical sectors. And it's not just, obviously, transition isn't just about technical sectors and energy. It affects everybody. And and one of the things that we do have to, you know, really look at is that there's no you know, the integration, that there are sectors that barely exist that need to be built up. And I've probably said it before on this forum, but you know, so but we, in order to have that conversation, there do need to be people from all the different sectors around a table and in the discussion. So if people know anybody that is from one of those harder to reach sectors, or are from one of those sectors themselves, then we're especially interested in having you. One of the things I'm trying to work on is trying to get a bit of good conversation around building up land work, and you know, how do we do sustainable land work in a way that at the moment it's happening, but it's happening in ways that are quite marginal to the economy, like in, you know, in the cooperatives and things like that. You know, how do we scale it up into a national thing that actually offers good, decent employment conditions and all the rest? So
that's it. I think, yeah, I mean, you're right.
Get in touch if you want to be involved in planning the body of that conference, because, you know, the more people get involved, the better ideas we can have.
Thanks, Helen. That's great. And just the last announcement there is on this Friday, the Institute of Employment Rights in London is holding a Workers for Climate Justice conference. And there are still spaces, I'm informed, so you can sign up for that if you are down that way. Has anyone else got any announcements before we jump into the main body of the thing? Jenny?
It was just the there's a
I saw your email.
action tomorrow in Sheffield, and yeah, it's come out. It's been supported by the Trade Union Council in Sheffield. It's really important because there's more cuts happening on October the 29th to buses, which will affect like evening and weekend Sunday services. So even though the fare cap's being kept, it's like a kind of Halloween come early, and we're going to have a zombie protest tomorrow. It's at 1 o'clock tomorrow, I think. Well, I should have this in front of me. Lucinda's nodding. That's very reassuring. Yeah, to just tell Oliver Coppard, who is moving on buses, but again, it would be great to have any trade union branch banners there, if that's possible at such short notice. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Jenny. Yeah, 1 till 1:45, I think the advert says, so not even an enormous commitment for anyone who wants to pop down. Okay, great. So if we move on to the main body of the thing, so the question this time was kind of quite broad. We were looking at what is a just transition, and then we'll look at the role of the Green Rep as part of that in a bit. So I thought to get us started, we'll have a quick presentation from Jenny, Jenny Patient, who will talk to us about just transition. She has just completed a PhD on this subject, so she is well, so she's an expert, so I'm sure, you know, no pressure, but and, you know, was with the TUC and has been a campaigner on this for a long time with various groups. And so shall we go straight over to you, Jenny?
Yeah, are you going to load my slides, Sam?
Yes, I'll do it.
Possible? Not that there's a lot of slides, people, but just so we've got some pictures in front of us.
Yes, 1 moment. There we go. Is that?
Yeah, so this is me. I've popped my new current email address in there in case anybody doesn't have it, because you may still have my TUC one, and I'm no longer working at the TUC. But as Sam says, I've just also finished my PhD with the University of Sheffield, and that was looking at workers and a just transition, and some of the theory I've kind of been using, I'll explain here, because I think it's more helpful in many ways than some of the. It's all very well kind of getting to a definition of just transition, but what we really want to know is how do we make it happen, and like why it's not happening. And I think that's some of the there's some of the reasons for that, which I'm trying to unpack here really. But one theorist that I did find very useful is on the next slide, a guy called Darren Snell. So he's actually working in Australia, and he did a kind of published an article in 2018 where he looks at the stark reality in a transitioning coal region. He's looking at the Latrobe Valley in Australia and what was actually happening. And he concludes some things which I found a really helpful point of view for thinking about Yorkshire and the Humber, which was the area I was looking at in my research. So one is that one thing that he concludes is that just transition requires more than just government provisions and interventions. And I think sometimes, like in the perhaps in the the ILO, International Labour Organization definition, it kind of assumes that governments are on this and that they're working with employers and unions, and it's all it's all going to happen in this kind of nice structured tripartite way. That isn't the case in the UK. I think it wasn't the case in Australia, and so it's quite useful to look at what else needs to happen or how else we can think about a just transition. And he also concludes that unions must perform an active part through their relations with everybody, really, employers, workers, government, community, to actually make a just transition happen. And I think sometimes there's a bit of a risk that unions assume that the climate transition is kind of happening, and then we just kind of like, just tag on the back of it, and we just kind of try and make sure it's just. And often the real problem is that the transition itself isn't really happening, and unions don't have a picture of what that transition that needs to happen is, that we actually need to reach net zero, what that really means, because it obviously means loads of things for our workplaces, and thus for the union role. And unions often think about just transition. They think they're just thinking about, they're assuming the technical transition's all happening and they can't really do anything about that. And then they're thinking about the social outcomes. And often the model is, oh, well, the government ought to look after people who kind of lose their jobs or are disrupted in their jobs through decarbonisation. But that's quite a limited view, and we'll go on to talk on the next slide a bit more. But let's just finish off here first. So another thing that, so this is another thing Snell says, is that unions tend to think more in these social terms than ecological terms. And he asks, well, what is the state role in achieving just transition? And often we uphold examples of, like in Germany or in Spain. The coal transition in Spain is a great example. It's affected a particular region. They've got quite strong regional government in Spain. They've kind of put lots of extra resources into that area to make sure that not only are the older miners, who are kind of like naturally at the end of their career, going to have good conditions on early retirement, but also the younger workers, a lot of whom were migrant workers from like Poland and places, were actually going to have alternative jobs to go to through investment in light industry and renewable energy, that kind of thing. So it was all very structured and state-led and kind of like nicely done, but we don't really, again, that isn't anything like happening here. So it's not the kind of model necessarily. You can look at it and you say, oh, it'd be great if we had that, but if it isn't happening, what else can we do? How else can we look at this? What needs to happen? And yeah, so then Snell turns to look at, well, what's the role of actually the industry itself, the private employers, and what's the role of the union? So it was a big just sort of jumping off point for me that I found really helpful. If anybody wants to actually read a copy of his article, it is quite readable, and I can illegally send it to you if you ask me for it. So I'm quite happy to do that while I've still got access to the world of university stuff. And I'll have the next slide, please, Sam. So this is my kind of picture of like, so what is happening or what's not happening? You know, why aren't we having a just transition? Perhaps looking with a more UK focus and a more so it is a bit messy. Look at the squares in the middle. This is sort of what's happening in a company. And on the left-hand side, we've got things that are happening purely because of decarbonisation. And on the right-hand side, we've got similar things happening that are happening for all kinds of other reasons. So it may be that the technology is changing, you know, it's about AI, or it's about bringing in very high-tech approaches. We've got companies deciding to offshore things and do part of their production in Poland or China or whatever, restructuring of different kinds. And from both of those, we've got potential loss of jobs, and we've got change in skills and the training that's needed, the conditions of work. So we've got a kind of bit of a cocktail of things happening. And a lot of the time what tends to happen is because climate change is a kind of obvious big thing, and climate policy is kind of like in your face, unions or others or workers or people say, oh, it's because of climate change, you know, because of climate policy, because of decarbonisation that we're losing these jobs, and it's usually more complicated than that. It's kind of a whole cocktail of things going on, and the company is quite able to blame, you know, sort of climate policy if it suits them. But in fact, it may be a decision they've made for purely economic reasons. And this has happened with lots of examples of losing jobs being lost. So all the things around it are things happening that are kind of like making this not work, or, you know, sort of causing just transition or lack of just transition. So there is climate policy, obviously. There's plenty of other policy that's also affecting companies and jobs. There's local economic conditions, which we must always remember. In Yorkshire and Humber, we are extremely economically deprived as a whole. You know, there are rich areas and poor areas, but we've got low productivity, low skills, low investment, low pay. You know, all those things are a kind of cocktail of horrible economic conditions in our area. We've got company decisions who take decisions without any reference to the workforce. So we've got this big red arrow at the bottom, this lack of involvement of workers and unions, which there's no laws in a way to actually make sure that workers are involved in any kind of decisions, let alone climate decisions in this country compared to many of our European neighbours or other countries. And we've got a lack of union capacity on climate issues. So it's not something that we've got a lot of experts in our unions, or that every branch has kind of got a climate officer or an environment officer, or every workplace has got somebody, an environmental rep with good support. We don't have those things. And there's other things that are happening, like changes in the supply chain. Obviously, carbon is embodied through the supply chain. Sometimes big employers, big companies say to their small providers, oh, now you've got to go more environmental because we're being told we have to. And it feeds through the supply chain. So there's these other causes of change. And we've basically got this lack of state support for just transition, which is really, you know, it's got tiny little mentions occasionally, but there's no real structural support for making sure this happens in a way that doesn't damage the workers. So yeah, let's go on to my last slide, Sam. And so this was a kind of matrix model that I used to describe kind of some of the things that were happening. Sorry, it's a bit too much to take in all at once, but basically it's going back to Snell's idea that unions sort of think differently about environmental concern than they do about social concern, and they're often much more up with the social concern than they are with the environmental concern. And so I thought about the social concern in terms of the breadth, the width of their concern, whether they're just thinking about a particular set of workers. And the answer is yes. I mean, at the stage when I was doing my field work, the energy unions, so Unite, Unison, GMB and Prospect, were really thinking about workers in the energy generation sector. And that's who they were thinking about when they were talking about just transition. And they shifted a little bit to thinking more about all workers, but they were kind of, or all members, but they were kind of very confused about what that really meant. And so sometimes they were talking about climate change with one breath, and that was kind of an all worker issue. And then they were talking about just transition, and that was purely for the energy workers. So it was a very kind of confused time. It wasn't a while ago now, and things have moved on a little bit, but not that much. In Yorkshire, I think we had a bit more of a kind of all members perspective, because partly because some of the local bodies like the Climate Commission and the LEPs and things were actually talking to the TUC and getting the union voice involved. We were actually thinking about it more as an economic issue rather than just as a kind of technical issue in the workplace. So there was more of a move to being all members. But you can see that unions are very much on this kind of on the left-hand side of the graph, which is like not very deep environmental concern. And really, when we talk about climate change and the youth strikers, you know, when you think about how they talk about climate change, it affects all citizens globally, and you need system redesign to actually address it. It's an ecological approach where you've got to think first of all about the ecological impact of what you're doing, and that kind of like thinking top down about the actual impact on the whole planet is really not something that unions do very much. We're much more in the kind of narrow, shallow kind of approach. But there is a key area that I've outlined in purple there, which is where all members or citizens intersect with an ecological approach. So starting to move to more thinking about reducing demand for, you know, not economic growth at all costs, but actually what kind of thing do we want the economy to do, and how do we reduce our demand so we reduce carbon dioxide being produced. And an example of that, a very good example of that, is kind of the Better Buses campaign, where we're saying if we need modal shift so that we produce less carbon dioxide, that will also be a really good benefit for working people more generally. So it's a brilliant example. And retrofit, which is very much kind of Sam's area of work, is another area where we've got that kind of what we call the co-benefits of actually great social outcomes and great climate outcomes for working people. So yeah, to conclude, just transition, you know, you can think about it in a really narrow way, and often that is the way that unions think about it or have thought about it. But the moment you start to think about it and you think about it in the light of climate change, which kind of connects everything together and all the causes and effects together, then you actually have to widen it out and start thinking about the whole economy, about the ecological impacts and the global population, because there's no point in making things better for workers here at the expense of making them worse for workers in Bangladesh or Saudi Arabia or wherever it is. So yeah, there's our graph, and thank you very much for letting me do this.
That's great. Thank you very much, Jenny. That was really good. Yes, lots of claps and thumbs up. I'll stop sharing now. So the idea here was to get a sort of sense of how we're, you know, what we're thinking about this, and how we can implement some of this just transition stuff, this just transition thinking into what we're doing, and whether, I guess, we're doing that already, you know, how far we're actually, you know, yeah, implementing these kind of ideas. So let's open it up. We'll do 15, 20 minutes on this. Has anyone got anything else to add that they think to expand on that, or that they'd want to add to our, I guess, working definition or our kind of, you know, ways of thinking around this? Joe?
Hi everyone, thanks Jenny, that was great. I guess just to add a little bit around the fact that the kind of origin story of just transition is kind of long disputed, but essentially it came from the union movement, and it came from workers on the ground who were being affected by often environmental issues that were kind of local environmental issues like toxic waste in factories and so on. And one of the, because we've also been looking a little bit at this issue, one of the things that we observe is that the concept has kind of been taken over by loads of people. So lots of different groups, like businesses themselves. I mean, some people have shared with me really interesting examples of a company, energy companies, having just transition statements that don't reference workers at all, or certainly might mention workers, but there's never been developed in dialogue with them. So I guess if there's anything to add, it's how we can kind of reclaim this as a union kind of led, a very important way of thinking about how effectively we're going. I mean, there are different dimensions to it, aren't there? Because clearly the climate is, a massive kind of threat to us in many different ways. But it is also a restructuring of our economy. And we know lots of people in our region have had a really bum deal out of not being involved in any conversation about what that means. So I guess some people would say, oh, well, we don't talk about just transition anymore because it doesn't mean anything because it's being co-opted by lots of different groups. But I guess my plea is that we just need to reclaim it.
I think that's a very valid thing to say. I think that's an important thing for us to remember, that it is actually a worker term that has in a way been used up by others. And I guess it kind of comes into the question of what, when a union does talk about just transition for its workers, it's normally talking about a new job, right, or training. And you wonder how just it is to move from one exploiting capitalist firm to another exploiting capitalist firm. You think, well, actually, maybe there's a little bit more behind this. Maybe on Jenny's graph, we do need to be moving further towards the right and thinking about, making society a lot more just, which we've seen some of the unions thinking about a little bit. But yeah, that's something to think about. Ellen, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I was just thinking that as well as Jenny's distinction between the sort of how, to what extent a section is ecologically concerned and to what extent socially concerned, it's it's the fact that unions are not supposed to be political in general, isn't it, in this country? I mean, if you think about, for example, the green bans in Australia, where workers, where unions have taken strike action over things that didn't actually affect their own site, their own workplace, but have been things that they've objected to on whether on social or ecological grounds somewhere else. They've now, that we're so far from being able to do that in this, I mean, short of very, very serious mass defiance of the anti-union laws, which would be great, but we seem to be far from that at the moment. But it is political, and it can't be sectoral, because if it's going to be a worker-led just transition, means that workers in every sector have to be, round the proverbial table, actually looking at how it all fits together, and creating plans that are not just pitting one sector against another or neglecting certain sectors altogether because they're sectors that are currently under unionized or under organized or don't exist in any kind of strength, and it implies, if you think about what kind of economy actually is a low carbon economy, it's not just one that makes its energy from renewable sources, is it? It's one that centres, for example, care work over manufacturing work, for example, in some respects. I mean, obviously we still need manufacturing, we need it, lots of new types of manufacturing, but so it's, to me, a worker-led just transition is one that necessarily involves a coming together of those, and that's part of the justice, because those sectors, for example, workers in the care sector are so grossly underpaid that typically, that historically have been highly feminized sectors that have been left out of a lot of organising. So it's that kind of shift that we're looking for as well in terms of a justice transition, I'd say. And that means getting everybody, a lot more cross-sector dialogue.
I think that's interesting. And while you were speaking, it made me think, well, is just transition therefore, if we were doing this to completion, as it were, is it possible without a kind of class consciousness or without a kind of class solidarity? Can it be done sectorially? Is it a nonsense to say, just transition for one group of workers? Perhaps it is. Deliberately provocative.
I think it's a bit of a nonsense. I think you have to think wider. You have to think about the economy, because the only what ecological thinking really means is about thinking about what our economy is delivering, what we want it to deliver, how it delivers the things we need, instead of delivering the things we don't need. So, how it delivers care, and it delivers looking after people, rather than how it, just that it makes more money and produces more stuff. And so it's a really fundamental challenge that we come up against. And I think it was possible to think, when Joe talks about the history of just transition, I think, there were some fantastic campaigns in the States around like cleaning up oil plants, etc. And there you could see a really common interest between the local community, whose perhaps their river was polluted, their air was polluted by that factory, that facility, and the workers in the factory who would also be suffering those local pollution effects. And if you cleaned it up and you gave it a good future, that was a just transition, and it benefited both workers and community. But now we've kind of lost that with climate change. We lose that local connection. The impacts can happen on the other side of the world because your factory hasn't been decarbonised. So it's like you've immediately, and then you look at the climate impacts, and you look at the kind of the weather, the flooding last week. It's like things then knock onto other things, and it affects other people's jobs, and it affects everything that's going on in society. So it's a boundaryless, but we're beginning to get the limits of like how much trouble can we actually give nature before it starts biting us in the bottom. And we've reached that point, really, haven't we? So we've not got any room for maneuver apart from actually reducing the impact of our economy on the natural world, in order to actually protect people.
Yeah, well, of course, yeah, well said. Lucinda.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I think I agree with a lot of the points. I think you can't, and I did think this is why the school students got it completely right in terms of their message that went out globally, was you cannot just do these changes in isolation. You cannot do it in terms of without an understanding of the effect that will have in other areas. And a lot of them, because part of the Trades Council, I was heavily supporting them in getting them along to meetings of trade union branches to speak at them and to kind of make that connection. And it worked really well. And I just thought they spoke brilliantly, because they got it completely sussed in terms of we need the trade unions on board. I don't think they were necessarily, what I think they found frustrating was the national leadership, was the sort of messages that were going out to members in different areas in terms of that whole, this is about job losses, this is, it's a very different message to saying we need to be at the forefront of a discussion of how we can create a better environment whilst protecting jobs. And because all of these things, I mean, a lot of people have said what I was going to say, but all of these things are about, if you're talking about a just transition, that is has to be absolutely every area of the system we live in. You can't just pick and choose different areas. And that comes down to, I think you mentioned it, Sam, you have to look at the system that we're living under. Does it allow for that? or does it mean that we just have to tap into the best that we can? And I think that's what young people were questioning, saying, actually, you know, we can't keep just going through this same trajectory. I mean, I work in higher education, and if you're talking about retraining people in order to make those just transitions, we've got a very broken education system. You know, gone are the days where anybody could access it without thinking about debt, without thinking, and that's, you know, and look at what they've done to the further education, which has a massive effect in terms of schools and so forth and higher education. So all of these things are really broken, and it's about how we kind of build to protect that and build on it. And I think that's the discussion that never happens, really. It's all about, I mean, I think, Jenny, your points on the just transition are really excellent, but it's about, therefore, how do we challenge that? How do we make that a difference? And how we just stop this division between saying, you know, the trade unions aren't interested unless it's about jobs and social, because I don't think the membership are talking about that. I think they understand completely, because they experience it. It's like the example you gave in terms of, you know, the workers in the factory being affected, as well as the people in the community around the pollution of the rivers and stuff. It's like taxi drivers in my community know all too well what the dangers are of them driving around and kind of, you know, in cars that pollute and so forth, but actually they're not in an economical situation to make that a difference, and it's how we create that in order to allow it to happen. Sorry, I'm a bit jumbled just because I'm at work, so I'm a bit
No, that's great. That's a
trying
that's
to
a great
change the
contribution. I think that's very
trajectory of the discussion is difficult.
No, I think that's all very important. We will take Debbie, then Jamie, and then we'll look at the next bit on the agenda. Debbie?
Yeah. Yeah, I had some thoughts around like your different sort of geographical areas, Jenny, and you had just these workers in just this sector or just this factory, which made me think of the Lucas plan that we got reminded of recently, those of us that were at Wortley Hall. And, you know, there was work done, wasn't there, with the offshore oil workers about what they could do with their skills. It wasn't as huge as the Lucas thing of, you know, the sort of products that they talked about making. And then I also noticed that you had a thing about reducing demand, and Lucinda was talking about, you know, and others about an economy that just produces stuff rather than care, if you like. And whether people on the call have any time for donut economics, because for me that is such a clear kind of thing of respecting planetary boundaries, but also being socially just. And I know they're doing a lot on that in Leeds, among other places. And then just, you know, some of the way people are talking about growth going the other way. And it's like extractivism and colonialism all over again, going for lithium or whatever, you know, in the interests of just doing the same job. So decarbonizing stuff, you know, I think you have called it, Jenny, business as usual with greenwash. So, you know, all these thoughts, like it's all big and complicated and interlinked. And I don't know if that made sense, but there you go.
No, it definitely did. Thank you, Debbie. Jamie? Oh, you're on mute.
Strange. I must have pressed the wrong button. Oh, I took my hand down instead of pressing the mic button. Anyway, sorry. Monday afternoon. I was kind of thinking about just in terms of what experience people have had in terms of using the phrase just transition, and how kind of intuitively people kind of get that when you raise it in workplaces or with people. One thing I've seen people kind of discuss is using terms like worker-led transition to see if that's something which is more kind of which people get intuitively, so you don't have to kind of, because sometimes if you go into kind of a more conservative workplace, they might say just transition, is that a bit lefty, those kind of things. So what experiences have people had of using that terminology, and is it worth investing more in that terminology, or trying to bypass that? It's a question I'm grappling with.
I think it's a really interesting question. I think it's a little bit like I work in retrofit, and the term retrofit is meaningless to the majority of people. And I think you're right. I think in a way it becomes a bit technical, right? It's a sort of technical term that that you can kind of shut out instead of having to engage with. Does anyone have any, Jen, if we come to you super quickly, and then if anyone has any thoughts on that, then they can put their hands up.
Yeah, I think it has some kind of intuitive sense, the term just transition, but I think there are lots and lots of problems with it. And I like the term worker-led transition. And to respond to Debbie, really, I don't take it that I wasn't saying that we should organise from the bottom up, because one of the biggest issues, that was my red arrow at the bottom, which said lack of union capacity around climate. And the more we can build in our workplaces to actually, so that people understand the impact of climate in their workplace and start to organise around that, like Lucinda said with the taxi driver, so that people understand, the links between things, even if they can't act personally at that moment. But what's our agenda? What we actually want to ask for as trade unions? Then that's the kind of really important organising for me. And I don't think necessarily badging that just transition is fantastic, but it's like talking about climate change, its impact in the workplace, future workplace, worker-led, other terms can often be more useful.
Yeah, no, I think that's valuable. There's a few bits in the chat as well that I'm sure people can see. Just so that we are able to cover everything. If we move on to the next bit, which was looking at the role of the Green Rep as part of that. We're in trade unions, and so that's part of a thing that we want to speak about. So if I've got a brief presentation to go through, a bit like Jenny's, and then we'll continue the discussion after that, taking into account of those bits. So if I just get this shared. Hopefully I can see it as well. Can I see it as well? Is that allowed? No, right here. So brief introduction to what we mean by green reps, or environmental reps as they're sometimes called. Just going to look briefly at their purpose, duties, and then organising, campaigning and negotiating, like the stuff they actually do. So what is a green rep? Why do we have them? I think this kind of comes from, so the definition is something like, and it varies from union to union, green reps are elected champions or branch negotiators on environmental issues in a workplace. So it's quite broad. And I think the starting point for this is that unions appreciate that environmental and climate crisis is in some way a union issue. So it's more obviously the case, as it kind of already been mentioned, for workers in fossil fuel industries, who sort of face a more dire and immediate issue there. But it's also a class issue, I think, because and I think more unions are kind of thinking about this in the same way, because it's the reason we're here is because it's the capitalism does a particular thing. It works in a particular way, and it is the fact that capital aligns with destruction of nature and further pollution, while labor aligns with environmental protection, less destructive production, economy geared towards social utility. That kind of dichotomy, I think, is at work. So in this way of thinking, workers are kind of necessarily will suffer more during a period like ours, where the environment is starting to collapse, and especially if capital continues to call the shots. And so if green issues are union issues and green reps are needed, I think that's the kind of level of agreement we've got between unions. but not exactly clear on what they should be doing. I've listed some of the purposes there on the slide. Any individual green rep might do some or all of these, and others will emphasize certain aspects and not others. Worker voice, transition planning, holding employers to account. These are all important bits. I think which one you come down on is probably about the lens through which you are looking at the environmental and climate crisis. So is there a moral obligation to move towards net zero or better? Or is there a practical need to decarbonize to safeguard jobs or potentially safeguard the employer so that you will have jobs? Is there a class solidarity that you need to educate each other, other comrades? Is there a political requirement to force employers to hear employees' view? They're the kind of things I think that unions are showing that they are aware of that dictate what purposes that they assign to green reps. So the green rep exists to take action and organise as a worker representative on the environmental and climate crisis, but there's still an open debate as to exactly what that means. And this moves us on to their duties, what they are supposed to be doing. So throughout, kind of across the board, raising awareness comes up. Several strands to this as well. Means raising awareness within the membership, perhaps even making the case that green issues are union issues, or campaigning for specific things. But it's probably also about raising awareness more broadly within the workplace to non-members, to members of other unions, and potentially with management. It might also be the green rep's role to raise awareness with even further with customers, suppliers, service users, local communities, and potentially with those things, but overseas, supply chain all the way back or forward, depending on where you are, I guess, in it. There's also an inspection and auditing element to the role, especially with those unions that tie green reps to health and safety rep, who obviously have these duties. They have time for those duties. The green rep needs to identify where their employer could improve by researching what's going on and perhaps comparing this to what the employer says is going on, what it thinks it's doing. There's an active discussion about what the green rep should be examining, I guess. Efforts might be directed towards interrogating employers' environmental impacts, their climate change mitigation plans or adaptation plans, their future business or their growth plans, their investment portfolios, or even their reporting of carbon emissions and things like that. Then, of course, off the back of this, the green rep needs to think about alternatives. And this is where unions diverge in, I think, their ambition, and many green reps get stuck here anyway, because what do you do with that? How do you find an alternative? They don't necessarily know all the science behind climate change or how their employers' investment strategies work or financial planning and things like this. So they can be a bit, these can be stumbling blocks. But this is where using the breadth of that union, and if you've got the links between unions and across the sector or wider, then this becomes a bit easier finding alternatives. And this is where the TUC, to plug my own role, can come into play here. I'm very keen to talk to anyone who wants to think about these alternative plans, so do get in touch. So then it's about putting these alternatives to decision makers and potentially negotiating for actual outcomes. There can be a couple of ways of doing this, I think, broadly, from looking at the unions. Either you negotiate with employers during normal business as usual meetings, which we all have to some extent with our employers, or you put forward a plan or demands for a dialogue towards a plan in your annual claim or in your sectoral claim, and kind of negotiate it from a sort of slightly more adversarial point of view. As a movement, we've had a lot more success in the incremental claims than in the big bang ones. So the bit by bit changes where unions have got into a room with their employers and, you know, set up these kind of committees, and they've come up with you know, relatively easy wins, I guess. We've had a lot of those, which is great. It's worth noting that there have been a lot fewer green demands made at a, you know, annual pay claim kind of level, or during a dispute. So although they do seem to have not met with that many successes, it's also possible that our sort of research pool is just too small. You know, we haven't tried it enough to know. There's a joint national just transition claim for further education out at the moment, written by a number of unions, which is really strong, but it hasn't really resulted in that much as yet. And then I think this moves us on to the active element of the role. UCU promote their Green New Deal bargaining model, which is shown on the thing. So it's review and organize, decide priorities, submit a claim, negotiate, publicize and gather and support, review implementation, and then do it all again to keep improving. And I think this is really good. It's not rocket science, but it's a campaign plan that I think works to like tweaks to recycling facilities right up to, you know, changing what the organization produces. So I think a green rep can use it at any level. Green reps use their own methods too. They often wear multiple hats in the union, and so they'll obviously tie in green stuff within their other interests and areas of concern. And green reps will fit into, I think, one of three campaign tiers, and I think that's an important thing to remember. There's different levels at which this is happening across the country. Green reps have been encouraged by certain unions and the TUC to some extent for some time to campaign around reducing workplace carbon emissions and negative environmental impacts. These campaigns have come from a sort of common interest approach, where essentially the belief is that workers and bosses have a common interest, a shared interest in creating a livable future, and so, you know, we should work together. And this does work well to green workplaces, especially in the public sector, but it has limited success in long-term and kind of impactful changes, especially when the employer has to fork out money to make, you know, any change. The TC and others are now advocating for climate and jobs action plans or similar. These are plans agreed with management for how the organization will develop in a changing world and how to secure jobs long term. These will probably work best, and kind of the UCU claim fits within this, in that, you know, they work best within that model. So pursued as a claim or as a result of a dispute. Not many workplaces have developed these plans, but they are being pioneered all over the place, especially in the kind of carbon intensive industries. Again, with sort of mixed success so far. At the extreme end, you've got sort of what's come up a few times and what Debbie mentioned explicitly, the kind of alternative business plans. So these are like the Lucas Aerospace plans. So it's an alternative plan put forward by a worker or group of workers rather, about making their company more, well, insert whatever adjective you want really, but greener in this case, or less damaging or more socially useful. So it might think about what it produces, who the company supplies, what it supplies to, how it invests, what sectors it operates in, and this kind of thing. So they're pretty ambitious. We've seen them for decades come up, but they're almost always reactive. They're thought up by workers once a company has collapsed and there's a kind of emergency position to try and say, well, look, no, actually, we can keep the company going if we do X. But it doesn't need to be reactive, and I think that's the important thing here. We can have a proactive approach to this, and there's places all over Yorkshire and Humber where this would work. You know, the Humber industrial cluster, workers there could quite easily, they tend to be very highly skilled workers in those unions. They can put together alternative business models for their bosses to cut the greenwashing and come up with better plans if they're wanting to. Workers in local authorities could make the case for massive investment in their retrofitting activities, which I would love. So get in touch if you want to do that, please. Workers in government departments are already calling for this to some extent. PCS have their National Climate Service claim, which kind of falls into this bracket. But also all across, the shop factory, all across the piece, factories, shops, contractors, they could all be working on these claims, working on setting up cooperatives or just kind of better ways of thinking. So I think the key here, regardless, is for green reps to work with their whole union. And this is my final point, to bring in the ULRs, to talk about education, to bring in health and safety rep inspection rights and expertise, to link with local green campaigners, tenant associations, political parties, and look for opportunities to use green bargaining. This is kind of what the unions are talking about in large part, but it's not necessarily being enacted. We're not actually seeing much of an action base here. And that's a pity, but hopefully we will see more of that. If we keep organising, I think we will. So I think that's the role of the green rep. Lots of variation between unions and individual reps, but there's obviously themes. So I guess if we go back to the chat, remembering Jenny's piece as well, let's think about what a green rep should look like. Is there anything missing from that or that you disagree with? And how do we bring in the idea of a just transition into that framework as well? Ellen.
Okay, I'm not in a workplace, so I don't, want to like pontificate about. But it strikes me that that is a lot of work and a lot of knowledge and expertise for someone to have. And to me, the first step would be to it's about convening, creating space for discussions at the base with all the members or all the people in the workplace, to getting people involved in that as much as possible, and making it a collective endeavour rather than, because of what tends to happen with these always, isn't it, is that it becomes, oh, they're responsible for that thing. So it's something about making it, from the start, that it's not just one person's job and everybody else can forget about it. That they, I mean, obviously, how possible or easy this is going to vary from one place to another. But
I think this is a really interesting point.
The first thing to do is probably to get people together on the at the grassroots.
I think that. Yeah, no, sorry to interrupt earlier, but I think that's right. And I think these things, it comes up again and again. There's a bit of an argument: should we have green reps, or should it not just be everyone? Are we talking green issues not everyone's business now, and so we shouldn't really have a lead? I guess the argument there is that, like, health and safety is everyone's business, but we do still have a great health and safety reps to lead on these things. But you're right. I think obviously, if we're talking about justice, right, it needs to be a democratic process. It's not going to be just one person's passion project to change the company. And that's not going to work anyway, really, is it? Unless we have the whole union behind us. Jenny, you had your hand up.
Yeah, just thinking about how the structure might work differently in different kind of workplaces. I mean, I'm part of a branch which is for the third sector, the not-for-profit sector, and it has members. Typically, we only got 2 or 3 members per workplace, and we cover loads and loads of different workplaces. I mean, some are a bit bigger, like Shelter, for example, we've got more members there, sort of tens of members there, but still not huge. So one approach I'm thinking about is actually acting as like environment officer or green officer for the branch, and then encouraging different individuals in different workplaces to take on, to develop some of the work that would go with green rep. And I'd also really advocate, sort of thinking about whether using the role of union learning rep can work for your kind of in your branch and workplace structure, because they have much more support, and a large part of what people the change that's being driven in workplaces is around climate change, and so it is a big topic for learning. It's quite authentic learning topic, and by signing up as union learning reps, you can get a little bit more resourcing, facility time, support, and in that role to actually perhaps do some of that work of thinking about what it means in your sector, what it means in your workplace.
I think that's important. It is also, I guess it's an interesting thing that not all trade unionists are in workplaces, and that doesn't really come through that much in any of the unions' approach to green reps, and so that's an important thing for us to remember when looking at this role. Lucinda?
Yeah, I just think it's important to also think about what it is that you want to concentrate on in your area of work, because if we try and put too many things together, I mean, obviously we're going to have meetings with the university as we do and so forth, but you can often get very bogged down in that, and there is this whole bold statements that go out from all companies, of which higher education is a marketized place now, in terms of the great statements that they put out and all the gold rewards and so forth. But actually what we need to do as a union is concentrate and focus on some of the areas where we can start to get win-wins and we can start to campaign around, because I think that's what helps members to feel focused and feel that there's something is happening. So the danger is, as a green rep, you could be taking on as everything and just end up in committee meetings with management, which becomes nonsensical. I think we have to make sure, and that's why it's good to have a green rep, because it doesn't mean to say that, like people have said, that person just does all the green issues. I'm an international officer, but I have lots of members come and ask for us to support things. I'll get them to write motions, all those sorts of things. And it's the same thing. I think it is about, the trouble is we have a very young set of workers coming up that it's very transient, their work now, because there aren't permanent contracts, there aren't this. So we get good people and then they move on, understandably. But I think there is something that the Trades Council can play a very key role in terms of helping branches and supporting and making those connections with other unions, because what we decide will bear for how we want maybe things to change within the universities will very much depend on what is needed from other workforces. Do you see what I mean in terms of their change and transition? So there has to be a lot of communication between the different unions and the different workplaces. That makes sense.
Definitely, yeah, no, it definitely does. That's helpful. And I think you're right. The incremental thing is not something we've discussed or that was in my presentation there, but actually there are these different models that unions work with, but it's not to say you arrive at one model and then stick with it. You can build it up, can't you? Build up capacity as you get more people on board. Daphne.
Thanks, Sam. Hi, everyone. Just wanted to pick up on a few themes and comments that have been made. In particular, Jenny's point about bringing in the role of the union learning rep, or ULR, because while that role has statutory facility time, and while there's usually no particular direction that a ULR is encouraged to follow in terms of what type of learning to promote, we have that ability to develop a learning pathway around strengthening people's knowledge in the workplace around green issues, whether it's something very, very basic or whether it's going all the way up to gaining a qualification. People can sort of jump in on a pathway that allows them to increase their knowledge and understanding of what environmental issues there are that affect them, their families, their workplace, but do it in a way that's meaningful to them, and that, whether you do it in little bite-sized chunks or whether you do it as a very big program, you can structure that to suit your workforce. So that's something that I'm developing. I'm a ULR. in my workplace and an environmental rep. So I'm using the ULR role to develop the environmental knowledge side. And obviously, at some point when that is sufficiently, that body of material is sufficiently strong, then I will sort of launch that and present that as something around the environment through the learning agenda. The other thing I was going to say was around sort of how we're organizing environmental reps in my workplace. I've got a couple of colleagues on the call today. We work in a city council, and what we've started off doing, I mean, I've been an environmental rep on my own for quite a number of years now, but not had anybody to kind of talk things through with. I'm really pleased to have these other colleagues now, because we can pull knowledge, aspirations, ideas. We can bounce things off one another, and what we're starting to do is develop a sort of a multifaceted plan. We're basically putting all of our knowledge onto a workboard, and then working out from there what we can do with this, rather than saying what we want to do and then saying how do we do it. We're just putting everything together and then seeing what comes out of that, whether we'll have some events or whether we'll have some learning that comes out. That's yet to be seen, but that's what we're trying to do, is just really understand each other's knowledge and value that, and then we can take that forward in a meaningful way. Oh, that's the end of my warble.
That's good stuff. Thank you. I think that's very. I think when you're looking through these roles, most unions assume, I guess because it's a new thing or relatively new thing, that there will only be one green rep. But that's not necessarily, there's no reason why that would be the case. And actually, yeah, if you got more than one, you got more than a small committee of people, then you're obviously going to get a lot more benefit out the back of that. Tracy, Tracy.
Thanks, Sam. Yeah, just to kind of go on the back of what Daphne was just saying just a moment ago, but also to kind of share with you my experience of promoting green issues within an organisation. I'm conscious that there's kind of like a tide of misinformation and FUD, fear, uncertainty and doubt that seems to proliferate. And I think it's worth reminding ourselves that we're already in a campaign for the next general election. And my fear is that, as we saw in the Brexit debate, about the production of misinformation, to support one particular narrative. And this is what I'm finding now when I just have ordinary discussions with colleagues, is they come back to me with all kinds of what they think are facts, which are probably more like beliefs around some of this misinformation. And I tend to feel quite vulnerable because I feel like I'm speaking with just one voice, and there's this massive tide of people's other understanding of a completely different narrative. And I just think that we need to maybe consider that we're all in campaigning mode now, and we're not going to get this message across unless we do it in a cohesive and in a together mode, really. I think just one voice in one organisation, it might make people feel quite vulnerable. It certainly does me at times. And I think that there's been approaches where in politics in other parts of the world where it's about flooding the zone with this type of misinformation. And I just don't know where we kind of go from there in a practical sense. So I'm kind of looking for a little bit of a steer around what we can do to stand up to some of this stuff, or do we just not, do we not fight that, when you're having a conversation with someone and you know that what they're saying is completely rubbish, do you have a stock answer or a response? I don't know. These are all the questions that are going through my mind. it.
I think that's a really interesting point to raise, Tracy, and it's something that I've experienced as well. You know, you sort of think you're on a level, and then you realize that actually there's an aspect of what you're talking about that has been taken over or politicized behind our backs. And yeah, it's a difficult position to be in. If someone has a very strong opinion and you're sort of in that meeting with them, then you're sort of stuck, aren't you? Jenny, I wonder if you were responding on that, or if anyone else has any responses to that.
Partly yes, just wondering which union you're in, Tracy, as well, because there are, I mean, I know I'm in Unite, and I've just recently joined some of the kind of climate justice groups, which are on like WhatsApp groups and things. Also coming out of our course that we ran recently, there's a couple of like WhatsApp groups as well. So, and I think it can really help if you can like raise something quite quickly with a bunch of mates who think like you do, and can actually sort of maybe suggest some ways forward, or give you some tips, or give you some more extra information that you need, you know, to have quite quickly. Might not help in the actual second when it's a problem, but you know, you can at least get a pretty rapid response back, you know, rather than wait for the next network meeting and ask us then, you know. So I don't know if you've got access to anything like that, or if you're in Unite, we can give you a link for some of that, or yeah, or maybe that's something that people in this group would like to kind of like have as a more immediate way of being in touch.
Yeah, I would find that particularly helpful, Jenny, and I'm in Unite. I just wondered, I mean, obviously with this is our second meeting. I mean, is it possible to sort of produce a sort of an archive or a body of resources or something that we can go back to, or, you know, kind of, I don't mean cheat sheets, but something that we can go back to, and, you know, because you do get these arguments around lithium and these types of things, you know, and it's like, well, what's the best way to respond to that? You know,
Yeah,
it's a rhetorical question, but
yeah, well, yeah, no, I'd agree there. It's sort of, it's unlike other union roles, because the climate, you know, organizing around green issues is absolutely everything on earth. And it's not really fair, is it? You know, like ULRs aren't expected to know everything you'd ever ask them, but we are. But yeah, I think that kind of thing, a sort of myth busting, someone put it in the chat, document would be really helpful. And so, yeah, that's definitely something that I think we could develop as a group. There were a flurry of hands. Ellen, do you want to go?
I was only wondering whether you were part of the Unite member. Also, that is something. Maybe that's a thing that, like the caucus does have education as one of its kind of ambitions. The key ambition is to try to shift the, you know, union policy in a more progressive direction. But that has to be, you know, that you can't do that without providing people with information. And so, you know, maybe that could be a thing that we could discuss as a caucus, is actually producing some sets of information on topics that people often find themselves being tripped up over, whether it's in the workplace or whether it's campaigning on the street or whatever.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. We are talking about green reps, so I guess apart from the people who've already spoken, do we have anyone who is a green rep in a, you know, who holds that role on the call, who would like to talk about their experience?
I am one, but I haven't done much in the way of proper green rep stuff as yet, because we've just been so stuck in the strike up with UCU in the last year or so. It just feels like almost everything's been about, you know, are we going to be going on strike next week? How is the negotiation progressing? How is factionalization in the union messing us up yet again? Which has been really frustrating lately. We have just had a kind of minor success in that we got our fossil fuel universities, people and planet motion passed at the AGM. which is hopefully going to open that dialogue with the employer so as to get me or other members a bit more involved in the various committees that the university has in terms of fulfilling its own green obligations. Because like every other big institution, it's got all these kind of big claims about hitting net zero at various times, but once you make the claims, you then have to do the work to make it happen, and it seems to be a bit more recalcitrant about that side. It's much more interested in talking to the fossil fuel industry and doing carbon capture schemes and all this kind of greenwashing nonsense. So recognizing that we're probably going to have to allow them to do a bit of their greenwashing nonsense, because again, it's about the fights that we can win. I think it will be useful to kind of get onto the various committees, even if it's just doing the really, really basic stuff like helping the employer encourage employees to switch lights off, or ideally going a bit beyond that and getting systems in place so that we save power without having to actually rely on humans to remember to do this kind of thing.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely. I mean, it's part of this is the stepping stone stuff, isn't it? And taking the wins you can to use them further on. Joe's got your hand up, and then after that, did Jessica? If you want to come in, then you can do. But yeah, let's go to Joe first.
I'm sorry, my connection is terrible, so I hope you can hear me all right. I was just trying to tether it to my phone. So far, so good. I'm a Unite rep at the University of Leeds, and I just want. I'm not suggesting we kind of go into silos of our own sectors, but I wonder, in the working of this group, if there's something useful of kind of creating some either conversation between people who are in education, people in public, local authorities, etc., because the context can be quite different, and so the cross learning, I think there's something to be said about us having an education conversation for at least part of the way that we network, or put in touch with us as little mini groups so we can share stuff with each other. One of the great things that's happened at Leeds is we've got the joint UCU, Unison and Unite Climate Action Committee. So that some people are reps, but it's just mainly people who are, interested in action, and we can have a kind of collective voice against the greenwashing of our institution. And also the other great thing that is obviously unique to our sector is we've got a really interesting coalition with the students who lead the Green Societies of different shades of action and political persuasion, but they're, it's good to come together with them, because the university listens to our students a lot more than it listens to its staff. So that's been useful. Thanks.
Excellent, thanks. I think, there's been a bit of chat here in the chat about let's put a WhatsApp group together for this, and I think that might help. And feel free to invite whoever else. I'll circulate links in the minutes, and we can always use that as a kind of myth busting thing, or to kind of organise groups within that, just so we're all clued up. Did I see Dave's hand up? Dave Douglas, yeah.
Hi Sam. Okay. Hear me okay? Kids have just come in, so
Yeah,
I just put my earphones in, so because it's
No,
going mental at last. But I just want to give a different perspective, to be honest, from my perspective, from my point of view. So I work for an energy company, big energy company, the big bad Centrica, that owns British Gas. And what's disappointing from our point of view is that they're not willing to recognise a green rep at the moment, any rights for green reps. We're ploughing on with the health and safety stuff and getting through the door just because of the health and safety rights we have. But it seems to be the theme of big business to not want to discuss this with trade unions. So, it's too hard. They can't make decisions quick enough by involving the trade unions. So, unfortunately, at the moment, we seem to work in this sort of silo. Doing some great work, I think, at the moment. The GMB heavily involved in trying to push forward the green agenda. But from an employer's point of view, from dealing with the employer, it's not a good story to me. It's not a good news story. It's a very much to say they are an energy company with a highly unionised workforce. I think it's 97% in my area. So they're not wanting to talk about the green agenda at the moment. I think the only thing that'll push it forward is a potential change in government, which then I believe will come to us then because of the connections we have in government. But until that happens, it'll be a struggle.
Thanks. I think that's really valuable. And I think you're right that that's an aspect of this that, you know, we kind of think of ourselves going cap in hand a little bit sometimes to our employers, but they do benefit from our links as well. You know, we've got a fairly joined up group, and if Labour are in government, then we are going to be in a better position as well. So it's something to think about. Our time is almost up, so I'll wrap it up. I think that's been a really interesting discussion. Thanks for everyone who contributed and who was here. We'll write it all up so that we can get it all. And there's a lot of stuff in the chat there as well, which is brilliant. So hopefully people are seeing that. But again, that will be included in the minutes so we can all see. Just before we do finish, is there any other business to cover? No, good stuff. Okay, well, we've the top of the meeting, we had lots of announcements, so I'm sure we'll all see each other soon before the next one of these on all of those planning and conferences. Thanks all. Thanks especially to Jenny for the presentation.
You're welcome.
See you all soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.